Hello, my Old Testament introduction students. It's Thursday. I'm going to make a video for you all. I'm going to tell you a little bit of things about Joshua, even though you already did that assignment. I want to emphasize a couple things about Joshua, and I want to also say a few things about Judges. So this video is about Joshua and Judges. Again, you're reading the textbook. You also have the file teaching handout things I make available on the module. That's going to be important to look at. Now, first, let's take some time with Joshua for a few minutes. Hopefully, I'll get through all this in 20-25 minutes. The book of Joshua is part of that Deuteronomy history that was mentioned with Deuteronomy. It was written later, probably during the exile, linked up with Deuteronomy. But the material and the setting of Joshua is obviously of the conquest, if you want to call it that. But we'll mention a few things about that. That would place the time of Joshua in the conquest, depending on how you date the Exodus, either around 1400 BC or 1200 BC. Okay? For our purposes, it doesn't really matter which one. Just be aware of those are the two general views. Question of history of Joshua, and I'll just hit this really fast. Like so many other things that we'll see in the Old Testament, and we already have, the book of Joshua is claiming to be about history, okay, about actual people from Hebrews from Egypt who came into the land of Canaan and settled, and in the midst of that settling, fought a number of other Canaanite people over a generation or so. Okay, so in that case, on that respect, it does purport to be about history, but at the same time, you have to realize that Joshua, as many other books as well, is written as a narrative. It's written kind of with a literary structure in mind. And so to be a good reader of the Old Testament and the New Testament for that matter, you have to know your history. You have to get that nailed down as much as you can. But you also have to realize that what you're reading is crafted. It's shaped into a narrative. And therefore, you have to allow the writer to use a little bit of artistic license, shape his story in some way. And like with all writers, sometimes they could use a little hyperbole here and there. You have to know what you're reading. You don't read it as a stark wooden literalistic way all the way through. Okay? It's a theological interpretation of their past. Let's put it that way. And now actually it's a prophetic interpretation of their past, like we talked about before, about how the Hebrew Bible viewed these. Now, the big thing about Joshua, Joshua itself is set up fairly clearly. The first 5 chapters, it's just kind of preparations to move into the land, crossing of the Jordan River, whatnot. The real good stuff in Joshua comes from chapters 5 all the way to chapter 12. That's the campaign, the various campaigns as they moved into the land. Once you get to chapter 13, it's just a list of, this tribe gets this land, this tribe gets this land, and a few other, details at the end, where they put the cities of refuge, where they put the Levitical cities. But chapter 13 to 21 isn't really exciting to read. 22 to 24, again, are kind of summing up some covenant-related things. The historical things really deal with chapters 5 through 12. Now, I give you an outline of that. I also kind of give you a visual story chart of how that works out. It's my rough draft story chart that I will one day fix up. And a map. Let's look at the map first. The big thing you have to realize is when you're reading Joshua, the book of Joshua does not describe some kind of blitzkrieg military assault into the land of Canaan. First of all, you have to realize that Canaan was not a nation state. It wasn't like Hitler invading France. Canaan was comprised of a number of city-states, smaller cities that acted as their own governing unit, I guess. And therefore, what you see in Joshua is these Hebrew people coming back to the land of Canaan, the land of their ancestor Abraham. And as they moved in to Canaan, they came in contact and conflict with a number of these city-states from time to time. And therefore, the best way to read Joshua, in my opinion, is not like a literal blitzkrieg military conquest, but at the same time, some scholars also kind of speculate that what really happened is that the Hebrews were just Canaanite people who grew up in the land. They eventually took over and they made up this myth of their conquering the land. There's no evidence for that, really. I think the best way to see it is, like I just said, is that these Hebrews moved into the land, and as they moved into the land over a generation or so, because that's what Joshua actually tells you, they eventually expanded. Now, the way Joshua is laid out, I'll just say conquests are laid out, it really comes in 3 stages. And you're going to want to note this, and you can kind of see it on the map. They start on Mount Nebo, kind of north of the Dead Sea, across the river. They cross the Jordan River, and the first thing they do is they kind of move into the central part of the land. And that includes the story of Jericho and Ai primarily, okay? That's where they kind of get a foothold and they start living. Now, after they move in to the middle part of the land, we are told that the Gibeonites, who are another city-state in Canaan, they hear about Israel coming into the land and they don't want to fight with them, so they kind of con Joshua by sending a couple representatives from Gibeon, but he doesn't tell Joshua they're from Gibeon, just down the road. They say, we're from another place outside of this land, and we just heard you are so awesome, and we want to make a covenant with you. And so Joshua and the Israelites go, okay, great. They only find out later that they had just made a covenant with some Canaanite people who live just down the road. And but Joshua says, hey, a deal's a deal. We made the covenant with them. We won't attack them. We won't destroy them. But because the Gibeonites made that alliance with Joshua, a number of the other kings from the city-states in the southern part of Canaan attacked the Gibeonites. And when they attacked the Gibeonites called upon Joshua to back them up. We got a deal. And so this leads to the second phase of the entrance into the land, the southern campaign. So the first one is the central campaign. The southern campaign starts off as Joshua coming to the aid of the Gibeonites, and in doing so, he goes through the southern part of the land and destroys these kings who had attacked the Gibeonites, and effectively, they take over that area. Then, later on, we are told of a third campaign, the northern campaign, where they kind of travel up north, up through Galilee, and they conquer a number of places there. So really, Joshua's conquest really kind of comes in 3 phases: central, southern, northern, and it happens not in a year or two. It happens over a generation. It's more of a slow rolling exercise, if you know what I mean. That's the first thing. Might be the first thing I said. I've said a lot of things in this video already. It's one of the main things you have to know of the book of Joshua. Now, again, I'm not going to go into every single detail of the book, but I do want to mention a few things. Let's see, the Joshua outline. I'm looking at the Joshua outline. You have to see the Joshua, the conquest in Joshua is seen as the conclusion of the Exodus, obviously. When they get ready to enter the land, then they cross the Jordan River, and miraculously the waters part and they cross on dry land, which acts as kind of a nice bookend to when they first left Egypt. They passed through the Red Sea. They passed through the waters to start this whole Exodus, and now they're passing through the waters of the Jordan to go into the Promised Land to end it. So it's kind of a bookend kind of thing there. Another interesting thing to note under the conquest narratives in chapter 5, 13 to 15, there's this odd little story of once they're in the land, but before they go to Jericho, Joshua encounters this guy. It turns out to be an angel of the Lord's armies. And the angel of the Lord's armies is there, and Joshua says, are you on our side or the Canaanite side? And he says, I'm neither. And basically what you learn, this is kind of a literary thing, this encounter with Joshua and the angel of the Lord, why is that in there? You have to see that the conquest of the land, at least in some way, metaphorically, if you want to say, the conquest of the land is seen as kind of a return to Eden. You have to see it against the backdrop of the Adam and Eve story. Adam and Eve sinned, they got kicked out of Eden, okay? And God placed an angel at the barrier, not the barrier, the border of Eden, so they couldn't come back in. All right? And Eden was the place where God dwelled. Now, here, the Israelites come back to the promised land. They're about to go into the promised land, and what do they encounter? They encounter an angel. And eventually, once they get into the land, this is God's land, and eventually, over time, when they get to Jerusalem, on the Temple Mount, they have a temple where God dwells. So the very view of the entrance of Canaan is seen in kind of Edenic terms. They're not saying it was literally Eden, but they're going to God's land is kind of in those terms to a certain extent. Now, another thing I want to talk about regarding the conquest is the biggest controversial issue often discussed with Joshua is the supposed genocide that Joshua did when he went in to the land. Because when you read Joshua in most English translations, you have things like Joshua went into this place and he completely destroyed men, women, children, yada, yada, yada. Now, this takes you have to be a good reader to understand how the literature is working. The Hebrew word here that's often translated as completely destroy or utterly destroy is called harem, and I have it there on my notes here. Harem can mean completely destroy, literally, but more often than not, especially in Joshua, and actually John Walton, the guy who wrote your textbook, wrote a book on this. He argues that harem literally means to remove from common use, to dedicate it solely to God. Now, sometimes that entails destroying something, but sometimes it's putting it aside for special use. So therefore, what Joshua is doing, sorry about my phone there, what Joshua is doing and what the writer is doing when he says that he put things to harem, long story short, is what they were doing is when they went into Canaan and took over these places, their main agenda was not to commit genocide and kill everybody literally. It was to wipe out the pagan worship structure. And if you read the stories closely, it's only a handful of cities that they actually said they completely burned down. Most of it is they put things to harem, which means they would, fight a certain people and then destroy their pagan practices and their altars and destroy those things. So it's like I give my example, it would be akin to the Allies after World War II going into Germany. And yes, they killed Nazi soldiers as they're fighting, but they don't go in and kill every German. What they do once they get there is they tear down swastikas, and they tear down all those monuments that Hitler had made because they want to wipe that out so the Germans cannot identify with that anymore. So in a sense, that is what the point that the book of Joshua is getting at, is they went to Canaan to wipe out the pagan practices. Now, yes, in the process of all that, they fought with other Canaanites, and there were battles, and they killed people. But even when it says, they wiped everything out, you have to read that as kind of a hyperbolic statement, because we learn by the end of Joshua and the beginning of Judges that the Canaanites weren't really wiped out. There were still other people there. So anyway, that's just kind of a small thing to keep in mind. Another interesting thing, I don't really put this up in the notes here, but I'll say it a little bit because I think somebody mentioned it in one of the assignments. there's an odd thing throughout Joshua that from time to time he wipes out the Anakim, or sometimes the Rephaim, and there's these giants in the land. This is what we get when they first went into, the spies went in originally. These people, whoever they were connected with the Nephilim in some way back in chapter 6. Now again, you can't see this as literal biological genealogies, because if you think about it, if you take all that literally, well, after the flood, everything, the Nephilim would have been wiped out, right? But the Nephilim were seen as these, we talked about that already. But anyway, the Anakim were seen as descendants of the Nephilim, and they were seen as chaos creatures, basically. What that means, and again, John Walton talks about this in another one of his books, is that in the Canaanite culture, in the ancient Near East, there was this view by people who lived in the city-states, that the outside of the city is where the danger was. Okay, that was the chaos, and whoever lived out there must be descended from some chaos creatures of some sort. Now again, this is just the general cultural thinking of ancient Canaan, and so those people who lived out in the boonies, from the city-state people's mindset, they were called basically the descendants of chaos creatures. They were dangerous. And in a way, you can kind of see this even in like some modern films. Like if you've seen movies like The Hills Have Eyes, or those kind of weird movies where, a group of people in a car drive off and they get lost, and they go into a town, and everybody in the town are like weird cannibals or something. It's that fear that we have in us as people, that out in the unknown there is danger. And so the Canaanites viewed that too. But the danger was outside of the city-states. Now, in Joshua, he kind of turns that on his head. And when he talks about the Anakim and having to fight the Anakim, from the perspective of the book of Joshua, the danger isn't out in the boonies. The danger is in the Canaanite pagan culture. Joshua and the Israelites, they are God's people. They are safe in the covenant. Things that are outside the covenant is where the chaos and the danger lies. And so the description of certain people as the Anakim or the Rephaim is the book of Joshua's way of describing the danger of these pagan people using that language of that culture. Okay, I hope that makes sense. That's a kind of a side note. I'm probably not going to ask you about that. But anyway, that is the book of Joshua in a nutshell. Now, the book of Judges is just downright fun. I really enjoy teaching Judges. I'm going to give you, again, you can look at the module files. Here's the big things you got to know about Judges, though. First off, the book of Judges, the way it's laid out, there's a cycle to it. There's a pattern to it, and it is, I think, on the second page of my notes for you. If you read Judges as a whole, and now that we're getting into more of the story narratives, when we go through this stuff, take the time to read these things. These are great. What you see in the book of Judges is a pattern. It happens over and over again with all these different judges. Is that it starts out with, if you look on the picture there, let's start with, Israel's in the land and they turn to other gods. They fall away from the covenant. They turn to other gods. And because they turn to other gods, they become subject to pagan nations whose gods they turned to. Make sense? And so once they are under the boot of these pagan nations, Israel then turns to their God for help, and then God will raise up a judge, a deliverer, to free them from that oppression. And once that happens, next generation, same thing happens over and over again. That's kind of like the cycle you see in Judges. Now, that's the first thing you got to know. The second thing you got to know is what judge means. Do not, when you read the book of Judges, don't think of a person wearing a black robe sitting behind a bench with a gavel. That is not what the book of Judges is describing. In the book of Judges, a judge is one who brings judgment. He is like a military leader. I've always said it, think of like Arnold Schwarzenegger in The Terminator. Think of it, the Judgeinator. You know, when they call out for God to help, he sends them a Judgeinator who comes in and destroys the enemy for them. Okay? So a judge brings the Lord's judgment on the sinful Canaanites who oppressed Israel, and he delivers Israel. That's what a judge does. All right? And when you look at the book of Judges, the main stories of the judges go from chapters 3 to 16, and there's a number of important judges. Ehud is a very interesting story, and I'll probably tell you about that one here. And then there's the story of Deborah, the story of Gideon, and then there's a side story in chapter 9 about Gideon's son Abimelech, who is a kind of a tyrant. And then you have Jephthah in 11 and 12, and then Samson. These stories are just fun to read, and there's so much to them. And unfortunately, you know, I can't tell you about all of them. I'm going to try to mention a couple of them. But I am having you do in your homework a reading of the Jephthah story, and then I'll respond to that a little bit in the homework. But these judges were all unique parts to different tribes throughout Israel. At this point, there was not a united kingdom. It was a loose confederation of tribes. Think of it as the United States under the Articles of Confederation. And you know how that didn't work out because each state was doing its own thing. Same thing with judges. Each tribe, they were all Israelites, but they were pretty much a tribal association. And therefore, when you read these stories, these judges come up within their respective tribes to do certain things. So let me tell you about the story of Ehud really fast. And again, you have to read these stories and appreciate the literary stuff that's going on. Here's the story. Israel falls away, and the Moabites put their foot on Israel's neck, specifically the tribe of Benjamin. And the king of Moab is called Eglon. Now, you have to understand what some of these names mean. The first thing we're told about Eglon, the king of Moab, is that he's a very fat guy. Now, Eglon means calf, like a calf. And so right there, visually, you have the king of Eglon pictured as a fatted calf. And spoiler alert, he's going to get ready for slaughter. All right? But that's King Eglon. And basically what the Moabites would do is they would force the Israelites to, come to their king once a year probably or whatever, to kind of bribe him and to give him tribute. So one time, Ehud leads the group to pay the tribute to Eglon. Now we're told that Ehud is a left-handed man. Why are we told that? It's important to the story. All right? And I'll explain it. So they go to Eglon to pay the tribute. They pay the tribute, and then Eglon... but what Eglon does is he smuggles a sword into the meeting with Ehud smuggles a sword into his meeting with Eglon. And the reason why the reason we're told he's a left-handed man is because if you're right-handed, you're going to put your sword on your left side. And if you're left-handed, you put the sword on your right side. Most people are right-handed. So the bodyguards who kind of pat down anybody who comes to see their king, they're going to check the left side to make sure they're not bringing a sword. But because he's left-handed, he fashions a short sword, smuggles it in on his right thigh. So basically, the reason we're told he's left-handed is to explain how he was able to smuggle the sword in to see Eglon. All right? So he goes in, they pay the tribute, and then he sends a secret message to Eglon and says, hey, I got something extra for you, buddy. And so Eglon sends everybody out. So it's just him and Ehud in Eglon's upper room. Okay? Because he thinks he's going to get a bribe or something. And at that point, Ehud says, oh, I got something for you, buddy. And he reaches with his left hand, takes his sword out, and we're told that he plunges the blade into Eglon's belly. Now, if you read the NIV tries to clean things up a bit, and he says that he stuck the sword in and the sword went down his back. That's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew basically says Ehud stuck the sword into Eglon's belly and crap came out. Because when you die, you lose your bodily functions. And so the picture from an Israelite perspective is this oppressor of your people is getting judgment, and it's hilarious because he's the bad guy and he's dying in the most undignified way. So he sticks the sword in, Eglon poos himself, and we're told that Ehud does not take the sword out. And the reason why, because if he takes the sword out, he's going to get blood splatter on him and he won't be able to leave. He needs to leave looking clean. So he keeps the sword in. And so Eglon ends up dying of internal bleeding in his own excrement. So after he kills Eglon, he then turns, walks out the door, locks the door behind him, and he escapes. Okay? Meanwhile, the guards at the door are waiting for Eglon to come out, and then we're told that they waited until it got embarrassing. Why did it get embarrassing? Because they're starting to smell something. And then they unlock the door, and there's their king, dead in his own excrement. From the Israelite perspective, that is a hilarious story. And it tells how God raises up a judge to defeat their enemies. Now, if you read every single one of their the story of the judges, there's just great stories. There's a lot of stuff to them. I know this for a test. I'm going to ask you this on a test. I'm going to tell you right now. I want you to know which judge fought which Canaanite group. So Ehud fought the Moabites. Deborah fights, basically his name is King Jabin and his general Sisera, just Canaanites. Okay, that's an interesting story. Very graphic. Gideon, this is easy. Gideon fights the Midianites. Okay, and then Abimelech is the son of Gideon. He doesn't fight anybody. He is the problem. And then Jephthah, as you'll read for your assignment, he fights the Ammonites. And then Samson, the Philistines. Everybody knows Samson and the Philistines. I'll mention one thing about Samson. Most times when people think about Samson, they think he's just, God used him, but he was a playboy his whole life and it got him in trouble. If you read the Samson story closely, the first few chapters, even though he's doing things that seem wrong, marrying a Philistine woman, doing this, doing that, chapter 13 is the story of his birth, and then chapters 14 and 15, he interacts with Philistines and he, gets into a fight with them and kills them. At every turn in 14 and 15, everything he does, even though it seems wrong, we are told that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. So it was basically God was impelling him to do these things that seemed improper, but it was God impelling him to do this so he can fight the Philistines. The problem with Samson is in chapter 16, where he goes with Delilah. And at that point, there's no mention of the Lord in what Samson does. And that's what leads to his downfall. He starts to take confidence in his own strength. And that's what gets him to fall. And eventually, once he's in bondage, he cries out to the Lord and the Lord returns to him. And that's how it ends. So, those are the stories of the judges. They're really fun to read. Okay? The story of the book of Judges in 1720 ends with chaos, and I'm not going to go into all the details. Oh, by the way, you can see in the last page a map of where all the different tribes are and where all these different judges did their thing. But the end of Judges, starting in chapter 19, has this disturbing story of a Levite and his concubine. They travel, you can read it for yourself, they travel and they stop in a town of the Gibeonites, who were the tribe of Benjamin now. And it's kind of a retelling of the Sodom and Gomorrah story, only the Levite and the concubine story is worse because they went to a town of their fellow Israelites who did these horrible things. And the Levite threw out his concubine to the crazy crowd who raped and killed her. And the Levite takes her home, chops her up into 12 pieces, and sent the 12 pieces to the 12 tribes of Israel, telling them, hey, the tribe of Benjamin did this, without telling them that he kind of contributed. And there's a civil war between the tribes of Israel and the tribe of Benjamin. And long story short, they fight back and forth. And even though they eventually defeat Benjamin, the rest of the Israelites had vowed never to give any of their daughters to any of the survivors of the Benjamites. But then once they defeat them, they have second thoughts and they say, well, if we don't give them our daughters, the tribe of Benjamin is going to die out and we won't have 12 tribes. But we made a vow to the Lord not to give our daughters to them. And so they find a way to get around their vow to the Lord, which is not good. And so Benjamin survives, and the book of Judges ends with, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And by the time you get to the end of the book of Judges, you see how screwed up they were. They constantly fall away from the Lord, and at the end, it's just utter chaos. And that sets the stage for the coming monarchy. Next week, I will tell you about 1st and 2nd Samuel. Thank you.